Hank Phillippi Ryan is USA Today bestseller, author of 12 mystery novels. Hank has also won multiple prestigious awards for her crime fiction: 5 Agathas, 3 Anthonys, the Daphne, 2 McCavities, and the coveted Mary Higgins Clark Award. She's also the on-air investigative reporter for Boston's WHDH-TV. She's won 37 Emmys, some of them which you can see behind her right now, 14 Edward R. Murrow Awards, and dozens of other honors for her groundbreaking journalism. National book reviews have called Hank a master at crafting suspenseful mysteries and a superb and gifted storyteller. Hank's novels have been named Best Thrillers of the Year by Library Journal, New York Post, BookBub, Pop Sugar, Real Simple Magazine, and others. Her newest book, which you can order for 20% off, you can pre-order, it's coming out next Tuesday, is an acclaimed standalone psychological thriller called her last book was The Murder List, a nominee of the prestigious Mary Higgins Clark Award, Agatha Christie Award, and Anthony Award. Her next book is The First to Lie, coming out on August 4th, and Publishers Weekly starred review says it's stellar. Hank Phillippi Ryan could win a 6th Agatha with this one. So exciting to have her here. Just read her books. They're amazing. And Marjan Kamali, who is a Lexingtonian, as you may know. We're very excited to have her here. Marjan was born in Turkey to Iranian parents, spent her childhood in Kenya, Germany, Turkey, Iran, and the United States. She studied English literature at UC Berkeley and received her MBA from Columbia University and her MFA from New York University. Her first book, Together Tea, was a Massachusetts Book Award finalist, an NPR WBUR Good Read, and a Target Emerging Author selection, and has been translated into several languages and adapted for the stage. The Stationery Shop, her most recent book, is a Boston Globe bestseller, was a Real Simple Magazine top editor's pick, and an Indie Next Pick, one of Newsweek's 30 best summer books, and an excerpt was nominated for a Pushcart Prize. It has also been translated into many languages. I would like to know, Marjan, how, with all of that world travel, you ended up in Lexington. But Hank is here, and she's a master interviewer, so she is going to ask the questions. Participants, you can put any kind of chat questions or chat tech issues in chat, and use the Q&A button for questions that Hank will be paying attention to. Thanks so much. So welcome. You're so welcome. I'm so glad to have you here.
Thank you. We love being here.
Thank you.
Okay. I will ask you, how did you wind up in Lexington? I'll ask Nina's brilliant question.
Well, I think it's kind of telling that the place I finally did end up, and I certainly hope this is it, because I'm a bit tired of moving. I ended up in basically the town where the revolution of building America began. But I came here after we lived in Australia, and my husband's job brought him to the Boston area. So I came here, and one of the first things I did actually was go to Cary Library. It's kind of how I like to get to know a town. And back then I was struggling to write my first book, Together Tea. And one thing I did is every morning I went to Cary Library, parked my car, sat myself down in a cubicle near books that didn't interest me at all so that I wouldn't be distracted. I was in the Japanese anime comic book section, and I forced myself to work in that cubicle. So sometimes I go lovingly by that cubicle because I spent many hours there.
It's so interesting to hear you say that, because we were talking earlier before the event started about how I'm in my study where I write and you're in your study where you write, and this is a place where people come at their peril and certainly don't often invite people in. And now with Zooms and chats like this, we're taking people into the places where we really work. But it's interesting. I mean, first of all, how do you feel about that? And second, it's kind of lovely that you have this parallel that in the library, when you go there now, the Cary Library was such a life-changing place for you.
It truly was. And, you know, now I have the privilege of being in this home office, which I never forget is a privilege, because like so many women, there were all these decades where I longed for a room of my own, you know, as Virginia Woolf likes to say. And it just wasn't possible when my kids were little. There was no even mental space of my own. But Cary Library gave me that when I was writing the first book. And now in this library, in this home office, it's funny what you asked, Hank, because at the beginning of the pandemic, when the Zooms began and the book clubs became virtual and everything was sort of broadcast from home, my neighbor suggested that I do like a tour of my office. And I was like, I just, no, it's private. I could never. And now the ice has been broken. I've done tours of my bookshelves. I've shown people my whiteboard. It's all fair game. I think one thing the pandemic has done is made us see that we're all kind of in this together, and everybody's home is now shared to a degree.
We live in real places, real people who are doing real things. And there's no more glossy, flossy exteriors. Although I have to say that you're braver than I. If I turned this computer around and you saw the stacks of paper and the stacks of books and the files and calendars and research and outlines, it would be a little, I mean, I know where everything is. Let me just put it that way. But we'll just leave it at that. So I'm not turning this computer.
Yes.
Let's talk about your wonderful book, The Stationery Shop, which started out, just came on the scene brilliantly and has not let up. More and more people are talking about this book, which is so unusual in what happens usually in publications. It's such a beautiful love story. Did you start out thinking about it as a love story?
You know, it's funny because when I started thinking about the second book, I knew I wanted to write something that encompassed that feeling of first love, and particularly lost love. But I really wasn't sure how I would go about it. And thank you for saying what you said about the sort of longevity of this book's appeal. It surprised me too, because as we both know, a lot of times books kind of burst onto the scene and then disappear. But it continues to sort of have traction and appeal to readers, and I'm so grateful. But the way it all started was something I would never have expected to trigger a book.
You know what, let me ask you something about that. And I know the story, and that's going to be my next question. But I want people, if they haven't, because this is one of my favorite stories of all time. But before we let you say that, in order to have the viewers and readers have some perspective, if they haven't read The Stationery Shop yet, just briefly tell us just the elevator pitch version so we can have a sense in our heads of what it is we're listening to, because then your backstory becomes just blazingly rich.
Yes, and I know you've heard that story before, but I will tell you what the book is about, just to give people a grounding. The Stationery Shop is, as you said, a love story. It's about two teenagers who meet when they're 17, and they slip briskly, as F. Scott Fitzgerald likes to say, into an intimacy from which they never recover. They have a whirlwind romance in 1953 Iran, at a time when the country's just blossoming with art and literature and theater and on the cusp of democracy. But then on the eve of their wedding, they're separated. The country erupts into a coup d'etat. They do not see each other again. And our heroine resigns herself to a life without this person, and she moves to America, starts a whole new life there. And 60 years later, in New England, she finally has a chance to reunite with the fiancé from whom she was separated, and she gets to ask him the questions that have haunted her and sort of been always there with her for the past 60 years.
In what you just said, even in that just little synopsis of the story, what you were talking about earlier about why this book has stayed so popular. I mean, this is such an essential story of love and loss and youth and age and growth and true love and tumult, personally and politically, how we all change by something that our lives are changed by something over which we have no control. I mean, you were saying, I think once that the Baman and Roya had their lives pulled out from under them. And I do think that is so touching and so emotional for everyone. So now where did the story come from?
Well, now I'll tell you where it all sort of began. When I was doing book events for Together Tea, my first book, after I visited a book club, a woman asked me if I would visit where she worked, and she worked in an assisted living center. And I went down to Duxbury, Massachusetts, and I did a reading from my book. And there was an elderly man in a wheelchair, and he kept saying things, and I wasn't sure if he was heckling me or cheering me on, but he would just go on. And later they'd organized this lovely lunch, because there's a lot of food in both the books. And we sat down to eat, and he kept saying things. He kept saying things like, I met the Prince of Spain, I traveled with Charles de Gaulle. And people just kind of shushed him. I just asked him his name. And then later on, many weeks later, when I visited my parents and my father asked me about book events, I did mention this man because he had an Iranian name. And my dad thinks he knows every Iranian American. And when I said his name, my father said, oh, he was one of our most decorated dignitaries. He met the Prince of Spain. He traveled with Charles de Gaulle. So he did all these things. And that's what really got me, is that everything he was saying was actually true. And I remember just sitting there thinking, what does it mean to be an elderly person in an assisted living center with this past that nobody believes? Or worse, they believe it and they don't care. And that's kind of what triggered the first image of the book. And so we start off with an elderly man in a wheelchair at the Duxton Senior Center, which is my clever disguise for Duxbury. And Roya goes to see him for the first time in 60 years. So that story that I love
it. Whenever I think of you, I think of that story, because one of the things I love about it is how we never know. And we can talk about this later tonight too, because this is also one of the themes of the book, is that you never know what chance encounter is going to change your life. And there are people who would say, maybe that wasn't chance. Maybe that was meant to be. Maybe you were fated to meet this person on your book journey. I just got goosebumps. I
just got goosebumps too.
Maybe we don't know. So, yeah. And you had to sort of rethink how you thought of him. I mean, I know you were kind to him, but you saw the other people doing, being however they would be. And knowing that somewhere in his heart, he knows it's true. And how did he end up in Duxbury? I mean, he obviously has this big story. So where did your two characters, Roya and Baman, is it Baman? Baman.
Yeah, Batman, but that's
Batman, okay.
Fine.
meet in a stationery shop. Why is that a special spot?
So I think personally, just as, myself, separate from the book, I love stationery shops. And I mentioned how when I first moved to Lexington, I made sure I visited the library. When I'm traveling, if there's a stationery shop in town, I like to go into it. And I grew up sort of visiting old-fashioned stationery shops that were small and had unique items. I'm not talking big box chain stores. And I remember one day my dad was telling me about a stationery shop in Tehran when he was growing up, where the stationery shop owner would pass love letters in between the pages of the books, so that the young people could communicate with each other in this way. And I remember when he told me that, I was just stunned. And I said to him, I have to put that in a book. And then as this book sort of started to bubble up, and I had the image of my elderly man, and I knew I wanted to explore that feeling of first love and lost love, I made sure that Roy and Bahman spent a lot of time in a stationery shop. And for those people who've read the book, I don't want to give any spoilers, but the stationery shop ends up having much more meaning in the book than meets the eye at first. And that kind of meant a lot to me too.
And it's, I mean, I don't know if I'm overthinking this, you know, goodness me would do that. But, you know, you've set the book in these dual places, in the sort of chaos of Tehran at the time and the stability of New England. And if you think about the word stationary in the homonym, it's stationary. It's something that is always there. So you're juggling these worlds and taking the reader to both places, stable and unstable, stationary and not stationary. Was that fun to do, to have Roya be in those two very different circumstances, very different settings?
Yes, you know, it was fun, and it was also really challenging. And I was very careful when I was writing the scenes in the Tehran of that time. The texture of the language is different. You know, people have noted that the language in the younger Iran scenes is a lot richer and sort of, there's much more sensual detail. They're young, they're 17, it's an exciting, glamorous city at the time. And the New England scenes all take place in the winter of 2013. And Roy and Bahman are both 77. And so I made the language of those chapters different. But one thing I was really trying to do, and I think, again, I got chills when you talked about the whole effect of stationary and, you know, the meaning of both ways of spelling the word, is that I wanted to show that for Roy and Bahman, after a while, time isn't linear anymore. Once they reunite, even though they're 77 and they're in cold New England, they are also strangely at the same time 17 and in the heat of the summer of their youth. And that was something that was really just exciting to try and accomplish.
That's exactly what, I mean, it's a time travel love story, if you think about that we are all time at all times. Just like the gentleman in the assisted living center is still, you know, he's still that 17-year-old who he was at that time and still that excited person that he was at that time. I know the answer to this and I hesitate to ask you, but did he ever hear about your book?
So, you know what? I did another reading for the first book, for Together Tea, shortly after that initial visit to his assisted living center. And I looked up and he was being wheeled in. So he became a bit of a fan after that initial meeting. And I never had a chance to tell him that he was the spark for the kernel of this story, even though it's not his story by any means. Bahman is not him. But he provided that initial spark. And then when the book came out, I went to the Duxbury Senior Center to do a reading. By then they knew about the connection, and I read in that same hall. He had since passed away, sadly, so I don't think he ever did know. But his friends were there, and for me, it was one of those full circle moments where you just think to yourself, how is this even happening? I mean, I joked with them that they had to give me the idea for the third book, but it was very meaningful to go back there.
And you know what else was important about that is that you got to tell the people who knew him that it had been true and change their entire, perhaps, perspective of how they thought of him. So you fixed his history for him. You know, you let that be healed which is a really lovely thing. You talk about how Bahman is not this person, but Roy and Bahman, how did you come to know your characters? It's a very difficult thing for these new people who never existed before to flower in an author's head. How did you do that? Or how did they come to you, a man?
Yeah. Well, I know being such a talented author too, I mean, not too, as being a talented author, that you really spend a lot of time just trying to imagine who these people are, and they're figments of your imagination, but they have to become more real than anyone you actually know. So some of the things I did, first of all, I started to write diary entries from the perspective of each of these characters. These are things that never made it into the book. I knew they wouldn't, but it was just an exercise to help me get to know them better. And by writing diary entries in Roya's voice and in Bahman's voice, I got pages and pages of material of maybe what they had for breakfast or what they were most scared of. And then all of that is actually in this notebook. This was the little green notebook where I did all my handwritten stuff for the Stationery Shop, endless pages of writing. And what ends up in the book is, that lovely iceberg theory, just the tip of the iceberg. But you have done so much work beforehand. And I tried to put myself in the shoes of somebody who would be 17 in the 50s in a country like Iran. After a while, in the beginning, it's so hard. It's kind of like banging your head against the wall because there's nothing to go on. And then there's that beautiful part in the first draft where one day there's a turning point and the characters do take over. And when that happens, I think it's the biggest high that exists.
I'm speechless with agreement with you, because you can't make it happen. And all you have to do is, you do your work and you do your prep and you keep writing and you just keep writing and you keep writing. And at some moment, it's as if a character is coming through you and out your fingers and onto the keyboard. And you think, oh, and you don't even want to stop them and remark, I think something just happened. But it happens, knock on every piece of wood available, every time. And Sue Grafton used to call that the magic of writing, when some subconscious thing would take over. But did you do all the green book writing before you started writing, or did you do it at the same time?
I did it at the same time. And one thing that it took me, sadly, decades to learn is that the first draft does not need to be written chronologically. Oh. It does not need to be written in order of how it may finally appear. In that first draft, I've given myself permission to just let anything go. And so as I was doing the little green book notes, I was also starting with whatever it is I knew. I knew that scene at the Duxton Senior Center with the characters' first meeting. I certainly did not know much of what happened in 1953 for them, but I did them both at the same time, and one could feed the other.
Yes, and it does, when you know the backstory, then the later story, there's a reason for things that happen in the later story. And when someone in the later story says something, you think, oh, I wonder what that's as a result of. And you can go back and enhance that. I just want to show you the orange book.
Oh my gosh!
Which is full of my new book, which is coming up. Although in the orange book, many of the pages say, I have no idea, I have no idea, I have no idea. But I write that anyway to remind myself that this happens every time. It happens, and I'm writing my 13th book now, and it's happened every time. So I can tell you, sister, it's not going to get any better. You're just going to know that's how it is. But look at look at the result. Look at the people who have continuously, enthusiastically wanted to know more about Tehran in the 50s. Were you just shocked at the hunger for that information?
I was shocked to my toes, Hank, because my first draft, when I first wrote the, completed version of that first draft, the Tehran scenes were very few. I wanted to spend a lot of time in New England when Roy and Bahman are 77. And the feedback that I received once that first draft was done from my agent and from some others was, well, gosh, we wish there was more time in Tehran in the 50s. And I remember thinking, no one wants to read about Tehran in the 50s. But boy, oh boy, do they. At least when it comes to these two. And so I went back and I wrote those scenes. And they ended up being some of the richest scenes in the book. And I never would have imagined that they would connect with people so much. But I think, as you well know, what people connect to is the emotion and the experience rather than the geographical location. So
yes, I agree. I don't mean to interrupt you, but of course I'm going to interrupt you. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I do think that the Tehran scenes are so voluptuous and beautiful and sensual and evocative. I mean, how do you know about the smell of the flowers and the cigarette smoke in the movie theater and how that even was? How did you put yourself on a Tehran street and in a cafe and in a movie theater in 1953? How did you do that?
Well, unlike in my first book, I could not use my memories because I wasn't around in 1953. And so I really had to create it. And I read a lot of books that covered that period. So I did get some of the factual political background, but there wasn't as much fiction as I would have wished set in 1950s Iran. I had the privilege of being able to interview relatives who were there at that time. Some of them were not terribly excited about talking to me. They kind of kept saying, I don't think the readers want to read about Tehran in the 50s. But then some of them really opened up. And one of the people who opened up was my father, which was actually astounding. I didn't expect him to, but he began to share with me what people were wearing, the kinds of music that they listened to, what they were eating specifically in the cafes. He was very specific about the pastries, the coffee. He told me about the dances that were held in people's homes where people were learning the waltz and the tango and the rumba. So a lot of those details, I give credit to him, and it was a privilege to have him to speak with. And then the rest, you just sort of have to put yourself there and imagine it.
What was that like to do that? I mean, I understand that was your father nostalgic or matter of fact or emotional or teaching you? How did you look at what the emotion was?
It was a desire to preserve a youth and a country that he felt has disappeared. Obviously, Iran is different now. So I think he wasn't really emotional when he was giving me some of the most cherished details, but he was incredibly thorough. And it surprised me because I don't know about others, but sometimes when I call my parents and I ask, to talk to my dad, and he'll say, oh yeah, everything's good, everything's fine, here's your mom, and I don't really get a lot out of him. But this was my excuse, Hank. This was my excuse to hear his stories. And long after I had taken my notes and I had more than enough material, I continued to sometimes pretend that I needed to know something because then he would open up. And I value those tales because once our elders go, the tales disappear as well. And I think part of me wanted to capture this time and this place. So much of writing is that, isn't it? Just born out of nostalgia and a desire to capture a specific emotion or a time and a place. So there was a lot of that.
I mean, that's what makes the book so layered and authentic, is that you have channeled the reality that your father knew into a fictional reality but it feels authentic. It feels genuine. It takes the people really there. And it's not just it's not just the fragrance, and it's not just the chic cafes or the dancing, but also the way that people dealt with each other, the way that people talked with each other, the rules that people have. I mean, I have to tell you that when I was 16 in 1967 or so, or 68, I lived for a while in Germany, and my best friend was from Persia. Golna was her name. And I remember and I hope she doesn't hear this, she was kind of a wild and crazy 16-year-old. I was the girl from Indianapolis, and she was this international beauty. I mean, just amazingly beautiful and amazingly knowledgeable and multilingual, and kind of wild, and she'd do anything. But wow, when I went to her house for dinner, she had good posture, and she said please and thank you to her little brother at the dinner table. And there was this whole new Golna that appeared when she was home with her family. Does that ring true to you?
You bet. You bet it does. There's a whole sort of, there's a whole societal way of behaving in certain situations. I cover it a lot in Together Tea, but also in the Stationery Shop. There are rules of what you say when someone asks you if you want to eat something, the refusal, the tarof, we call it. So many manners that you must learn. And I know even to this day, even though, I grew up here for the most part, when I'm with my parents or with other Iranians, I will remind myself to behave differently, even in body language with those kinds of situations. There's a formality sometimes with elders that you do not, ignore. Even in Farsi, you change, just like in French, right? You change from the singular you to the plural you. And with body language, I think you're just a bit more buttoned up and polite and deferential when there's older people around. When there's people that you don't know, you're accommodating and superbly pleasant. That's the other thing that's strange, is like this need to be cheerful and pleasant even when you don't feel like it, which I think in American culture we're a little bit more lax about that. We let our hair down a bit more. So I can totally relate to what you were saying about your friend.
Forget that she was so different in those two places. But back, talk about 1953 Tehran with two 17-year-olds who seemed very sophisticated and very un-American 17-year-old. They had their thoughts and their emotions and their philosophy and their way of looking at at how the world works and what they plan to do. How was that? How did you come to decide that they would be that way? How realistic was that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because sometimes when we think of 17-year-olds today, and I have one, it's hard to sort of think of them as Roy and Bahman, right? Because Roy and Bahman, like you said, do seem much more sophisticated and ahead in their lives in the world. But part of it was the function of the life expectancy at that time. 17 then, especially in Iran, was a lot older than today. There wasn't this kind of extended adolescence. You didn't even consider them as teenagers the way we would define teenagers today. You'd be well on your way to possibly getting married if you weren't already married. So Roya and Bahman in 1953, I would say their being 17 is almost like the equivalent of a 27-year-old today, just in their advancement in some of their life goals. At the same time, though, they are 17, right? And some things don't change. And I deliberately wanted them to be young because that level of intensity where you just fall head over heels in love, blinded by it, I think happens more often when you're young than when you're maybe a little bit more seasoned. I mean, they're both quite naive.
I mean, it's such a Romeo and Juliet kind of moment, even though they were older than Romeo and Juliet. I mean, it's interesting in the book, and this is not a spoiler in any way, that you, as you say, you start in the nursing home 60 years after they met. So we as readers know that they will see each other again, not that we know what will happen. Why did you decide to start at the end, essentially, and not from the beginning?
You know, that for me was everything. It meant the world to me to start the book with the reader knowing that they were not together for 60 years. Because for me, this is a story about lost love as opposed to just a love story. And, you know, when the book was being shopped around, there was one person who was quite interested, but their suggestion was, I start the book when Roy and Bahman are 17 and they first meet in the stationery shop, and that we then go along chronologically and build our way to 2013. And I remember thinking about it, but I could not do it. It was a deal breaker. Because for me, you must start knowing they were not together, and that frames what you then learn about how they met and how they fell apart and how they reunited. You need that framing for this particular story.
I mean, it gives you the emotion of it being lovely. It's a different kind of emotion than, oh no, they're separated, is becomes the crux of the story, not the reunion as the crux of the story. And that, I mean, that's what I think that you handled so beautifully. And in the book, you have her grandmother say, and I wrote this down, we are born, you're born, our fate is written on our foreheads. I dictated it, and so the dictation software, you can't even believe what's on my piece of paper here. But our fate is written on our foreheads. What does she mean by that, and how does that infuse the whole book?
So that's a common Persian saying, and it's also a common belief in the Persian culture that your fate precedes you, which is very different than our American belief that we, by our will, create our destiny. And when she says your fate is written with invisible ink on your forehead, what she's saying is you may think that you have control over how things turn out, but it's predetermined. And that was a huge theme for me for this book, was fate, because Roya and Bahman believe they should be together. Their fate is to not be together. And over the course of the book, it's about coming to terms with fate, coming to terms with plan Bs, the alternate path that you may have thought you wouldn't take. And for Roya, I hope what ends up happening at the end is a sort of healing where she gets to come to terms with what's happened for her.
I mean, it's a book about such loss and how we deal with loss and grief, and whether something is ever truly gone, and how we preserve that. I mean, it's about our personal history, emotional history, and the reality of time. I mean, it's a love story. But how did you, I mean, you must have cried writing this.
Oh, Hank, I cried my eyes out. I cried so much. This desk, was covered with tissues. At one point I took a photo, because no one would have believed me, used tissues full, like all over the place. I truly cried my eyes out. And it's not that I intended to write such a sad story. In fact, at the beginning, I was relieved that I was free of telling the story of Together Tea, which was semi-autobiographical. So I thought, oh, yay, I get to like just make up a tale in 1950s Iran, yay. And then as I wrote and as it unfolded, I was bulldozed. There were times I had to stop. It's good I wasn't at the Cary Library anymore, because I think people would have worried about me. Though I did write parts of it at Cary also, but not those scenes. And, you know, like you said, it is about a lot of loss that Roya goes through. I did not expect her to go through as much as she did. But hopefully by the end, she's able to really see what she has gained. I don't want to be as crass as to say anything in our emotional lives could be a cost-benefit analysis. But she, at the end, towards the end of her life, realizes that she has gained far more than she has lost. And some of the things she has gained are because of the losses. She has Walter. She would not have had Walter, her husband, if she was with Bahman. She would not have Kyle, many, many things. So I think it's sort of a way of accepting that we lose so much as we go through this journey, but we gain maybe deeper and better things.
It's one of those things now, especially, it's such a poignant and terrifying time that we're all involved in right now, that we sort of we have no idea what's going to happen, that sort of feeling of unsettledness. The world gets pulled out from under us, like Baman and for Roya. So it's a perfect time to read this novel. Let me check the Q&A so we don't leave anybody out there. Oh my goodness, Myra is saying, is this right over the middle of the screen? Is it blocking you? Myra says, my mother had a similar real life experience. She and her high school sweetheart in Berlin were separated during the Holocaust. My mom came to the US. He went to France. 50 years later, they reunited, married, and shared 20 more years together.
Oh my God.
So here's your next book, my dear. Right here at the Cary Library. That is just amazing.
That is amazing. You know what, Hank? Those kinds of reactions are the emails I receive. And we were talking before about my crying, writing the book. I have cried from the emails. People have opened up. You know, I think sometimes when somebody reads a book that's emotionally impactful, they feel like they can trust the author. So I've heard stories like that. And
it's such an interesting way of putting it, that they feel like they can trust the author. You must know something, and it connects with them on some level, and they feel as if they know you because you've shared this experience, even though it's actually your characters who have the experience. They know it's you. They know you made these people up from something in you. I can understand why you cry. You know,
it's a huge honor to have these secrets shared with me, but also, yeah, they do trust me because they feel, even if it may not have been my experience, that I am aware of this situation that they've gone through. And so sometimes they write letters to their first loves after reading the book.
I mean, the letters are so critical to the book. But did you always want to be a writer? What did you do before writing?
I've had so many lives. I always wanted to be a writer. It wasn't always in the cards, and I've had many, many detours. I worked at a pharmaceutical company. I got an MBA. I was with a theater group in Switzerland for a while. I've had many, many lives. I always wanted to be a writer, Hank, and kind of like you, I know you used to read those Nancy Drew mysteries in the barn, I think. I gorged on anything I could read when I was a kid, and the cake was baked, you know? I think when you read so much when you're little, it just affects you.
No, there was no, I mean, I didn't start writing till I was 55, but there was no way that that wasn't going to happen. It just wasn't the time for it to be, you know, and that's sort of, that's what I also take from your book as well, is that when it's the time for the thing, you know, maybe Roya's grandmother is somewhat right about some things. When it's the time for the thing, then that is when that happens. I mean, we're running out of time, and I don't want to keep people here. I know people are going for dinner or wishing that they were doing something else, but you are completely gloriously fabulous about this. You know, when I asked you at the beginning, you know, to what do you attribute the longevity of your book? You know, in this 45 minutes, it's just so clear why people hold this book close to them and why they treasure it and read it again and again. What do you want? I mean, how do you want people to feel at the end of your book?
Wow, that is such a great question. I think I want them to feel the way I felt at the end of writing it, which is as though they've gone through a catharsis. And I don't want to be cliche about this, but I will be cliche about this. As though they went through a healing. I finished the book a different person than when I started the book. I was a different person because of Roya, because of Batman, because of this time and what they went through. And I would hope that my readers finish the book feeling hopeful, because again, despite everything Roya went through, she came out the other side with this greater perspective, which is an amazing gift. I think we underestimate the power of perspective and how liberating that can be. And I think one of the reasons the book still is connecting to people is because, especially in these pandemic times when people, like you said, feel so unsettled, it's affirming to read the story of someone who comes out the other side, not with a huge, you know, confetti and hoopla, but just with this quiet peace, which is the most you could really ask for, I think.
I completely agree. We've just gotten flooded with a million questions suddenly. And if you don't, do you mind? I'd love to ask them because they're really good questions.
Yeah.
How long did it take for you and me to write your books? All right, we'll see here. How long did it take for you to write The Stationery Shop?
Well, Hank, I'm kind of embarrassed answering this with you sharing the screen because I know how prolific you are. However, it's good we're asking about The Stationery Shop and not my first book, because that was 10 years. The Stationery Shop took me 2.5 years to write the draft, and then another year to revise. So 3.5 total. And
wasn't that revision glorious? Didn't you love? I love the revision. My time was much more truncated than you had.
I know.
I have to write. I write a book. Get to write a book every year. But I think as a result of I've been a television reporter for so long that storytelling has been is so deeply in my brain, that sort of rhythm of a thriller, which is different from The Stationery Shop. You know, I write page-turning cat and mouse thrillers. That's what The First to Lie is, and that's what The Murder List is. You know, I want you to, you know, it's interesting because I want you to miss your stop on the T because you're turning the pages so fast you just want to see what happens. But in The Stationery Shop, you know, you don't read it that way. It's total immersion reading. So I think that some of the timing of the writing has to be reflected in that. You know, it's just a different kind of thing. Here's just Sue is asking 2 questions. which I think are both fantastic questions. One is, because they're hilarious, one is, which part of Together Tea is semi-autobiographical, and do you ever Skype or Zoom book clubs? So
Oh my goodness.
In the offing here from Sue.
I'll answer the easy part first. I Skype and Zoom book clubs on the regular from this chair. My kids are used to me, you know, I'll cook dinner and then I'll go upstairs and change my top and come back here. I've been doing a lot. So yes, I do Zoom with book clubs. As for Together Tea, my mother never made spreadsheets to find me a husband, as far as I know, unlike the mother in Together Tea. But the parts that are true, Sue, are I left Iran at the same age Mina did in the book, and I went back to visit Iran as an adult at the same age Mina did in the book. And some of the school scenes that happened in the childhood years in Iran during the war were also from my own experience. And I was at Columbia Business School, like the character did. Yeah.
Was that, I don't know, I was going to say lovely, and then I was going to say emotional, and then I was going to say heartbreaking to write. Which of those?
All of the above, which is, I think, why it took so long. And it was my first book, and I had 2 kids, so I took 6 years off and all of that. It was good to write it because it helped me process a lot of things and, you know, give Mina this lovely coming of age that mirrored my own. So, yeah.
And also lets you, when you write something like that, then you become who you are now. You know, you're sucking your old self into that book, and that has covers that you can close. Then you go on to be the new you.
Amen. I couldn't put it better myself. Yes.
So,
yeah.
2 more fast questions. Jen is saying, Jen is saying, do you have any recommendations for, you see me squinting at the screen, do you have any other recommendations for other historical fiction and or nonfiction to learn more about Iran in the 50s as well as the 80s? This came up at a book club I just hosted for Together Tea. So Jen, thank you, that's great. What other, I mean, on your website, are there recommendations for books?
Not on my website, but there have been amazing books coming out and have come out. One sort of classic now is Persepolis, which is a graphic novel. I don't know if you've read that. That is beautiful. That covers the sort of period of the 1979 revolution. Another book that covers the 50s and some of the 60s is Song of a Captive Bird, which is based on the life of a real poet. That's by Jasmine Zarnick. Oh my gosh, I'm looking at my bookshelf.
That's perfect.
Yeah. So, there's also the memoir Persian Girls by Nahid Rashleen, which is just lovely. It's her own story. It's nonfiction. And I'm just also looking at my desk because I have this all here.
Isn't this the first question? This is the, you know, Kimmer is asking too, what are some of your favorite authors and books? And whenever I do book events and someone asks me that, I completely go blank. I completely have no idea. And then in the car on the way home, I'll say to my husband, the next time I have an event, I'm going to go in there with some answers. I'm going to have answers. And then I never do, you know, because I'm reading something new all the time, and there's always something next. Can you come up with some of your favorite books and authors?
I can, only because of having been in that position so many times, of which you speak, where I've just been unable to answer the question at the time. But I will tell you a book that influenced me so much. Well, Gabriel Garcia Marquez influenced me. So 100 Years of Solitude and Love in the Time of Cholera. But when you read the latter, with today's mindset, there are some very disturbing things in it, but still gorgeousness. Toni Morrison's Sula affected me and is influencing a lot the next book I'm working on. And as of late, just not sort of classics, but books I've read that I adored. I liked The Dutch House by Anne Patchett, and I found that to be incredibly well done with all the time shifts. And also did love The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna, which is this saga about this Italian family that is just amazing. So if you want like a really long book where you go through generations of a family, it's lovely.
It's interesting that I love The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna. It's so interesting because it shows you about something about the universe. That one of my favorite current books is called The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle.
Oh my gosh.
A thriller, a multi-point of view, really crazy, wacky, by Stuart Turton. This crazy structure thriller. But the idea that those titles, which are so out of the blue, are so similar, is really quite incredible. Couple last questions. One is, Sue was saying The Last Days of Cafe Lila by Donna Bijan is a novel about Tehran in the 80s.
Oh, yes.
And Myra is saying, do you or Marjan have experience participating in writing groups or seminars? I do, certainly. Go to my website, and there are hankphillippyryan.com, cleverly. I teach a lot, actually. I love to teach specific skills, crafts, how to write a first chapter, how to handle the middle of a novel, how to start from moment one, and how if you have a good idea and how to make it into a good idea, writing setting and point of view, that very, very craft-oriented kind of teaching, which I love to do, it's such a surprise how much I enjoy it. So that's all on my website. How about you? Do you do teaching too?
I do. I teach. I used to teach at BU, and now I teach at Grub Street, which is, this huge, lovely creative writing center in Boston. We're so lucky to have it. And I teach writing the novel. No surprise there. So yes, I do teach at Grub Street. And Hank, I just have to say, one of the best pieces of advice you gave me, I think it applies to writing, to everything. When I was speaking to you at the Salem Literary Festival last fall, I said to you, how do you do it? How do you, the investigative journalist, 12 books at that time, all of these things you do. And you said, I do one thing at a time. And I know it sounds maybe strange, but that's really helped me. When I'm doing the thing I'm doing that one thing and trying not to worry about all the other things.
Well, I'm glad that helped you. I think of that every day. I mean, I say I'm doing this now and I do this. I used to multitask, and I realized that was just not, it was less than efficient. It was anti-efficient. And that I would really get things done if I absolutely focused. I can tell you in closing now that, Kimmer is saying Hank is amazing. That's I'm going to just take a little picture of that on the screen. Thank you. Okay. In order to get myself to focus on writing now, what I do is I set a timer for 34 minutes.
Yes.
Promise myself that in that 34 minutes I will do nothing else. So it's like being a 5-year-old. I give myself.
I do that too. That's my entire method. I set a timer. It's the Pomodoro Method. And I set it for either 30 or 45 minutes.
You do?
Yes. And I used to have my iPhone alarm to the sound of ducks quacking. And then after like 45 minutes, I'd hear these ducks and I'd run to the window and say, where are the ducks? And then I'd realize, oh, that's the end of my session. So it's so helpful. What's that?
You fooled yourself every time with it.
That's yourself. It's so great. Highly recommend that method.
It's so funny that we both do that.
Yeah.
I didn't know it had a name, but that is.
Yes. Yep. And you can do it for anything. You can do it for any task you want to focus on.
Because it gives you a beginning, middle, and an end. and it's just like snapping off the ends of beans for dinner. That you have a certain amount of things to do, and then and you can see the end, and it's a doable thing. You know what? The way I look at that is, and you all, we're just talking now. I allow myself to succeed instead of failing every day. Mm-hmm. By 34 minutes, and then another 34 minutes, and then another 34 minutes. I win. I come out and say, I wrote today. I did my words, and that fills me with enthusiasm for the next day, rather than saying, "Oh no, I didn't get done." Do you know?
I completely know what you're saying, because I think it becomes like a snowball effect. Because if you're constantly feeling disappointed that you didn't get what you wanted to get done, then you start to feel down, and then that affects everything. So I always tell my students too, just make your goals a little more attainable.
Exactly.
Because success breeds success. And yes, I totally agree with you. And it's so nice knowing that there's an end, like when the ducks start to quack, because then you're not intimidated by starting the project, because you know, like you said, there's an end, and then I get to get up and have fun.
And be happy.
Yes.
So I think right now in this interview, I'm hearing ducks outside. And it is now time to say goodnight. So I am so grateful to get to talk with you, all of you, dozens and dozens of people who are participating with us here tonight. I feel such joy to be able to have allowed Marjan to let us in on her life, and that we've been able to share these secrets that we didn't even know about each other, which is quite amazing. So what an honor to be here at Cary Library, where Marjan's first book came to be, and Mina is now going to come back on the screen and say goodnight to you all. Marjan, any last words?
Yes. First of all, Mina, thank you for having us, and you are the main character in Together Tea. So that's
I know. I kept hearing my name, and I was like, "What? Am I back on?"
Yes. So there's so many little serendipitous connections. But Hank, I cannot thank you enough. This was just a delight. I knew being interviewed by you would be different and just a lovely experience. No, in the best of ways, So I appreciate it very much. And at the risk of being corny, I do believe in kindred spirits. So I'm very grateful that we were able to have this evening. And thank you to everybody who joined in and everybody who writes your beautiful emails to me. I promise I will keep your secrets.
You can trust her.
Yes.
So I would like to thank both Hank and Marjan for coming here tonight. And I have chills from what you've been talking about. I feel like crying. It's just, you made it so real. And, part of it is the questioning, just finding the right questions to bring out the right answers. And part of it is being so eloquent with your answers. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. For everybody who's here, remember you can still buy books, signed books, by Hank and Marjan through Haley Booksellers. The link is in the chat, and I will send it out in an email as well. I would like to thank LexMedia and our foundation, of course, but mostly for everybody who came and listened into this amazing conversation. That's my cat telling me I have to feed him. So we're going to go, but have a wonderful night. Thank you, Hank and Marjan, again.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.